Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Brett Hancock, continuing with part 3D of Divorce and Remarriage series here. After we complete this is it for part 3. I apologize that I divided this into 3 parts, but it was so big that if I put it in one massive 2-hour chunk out there, I don't think many people would listen to it. So I just felt like I needed to divide it into 4 parts. And like I said in part 4, as I've been kind of posting here lately, I know along the way since part 1, I've kind of been changing some things on the fly, and apologize for that as well. But hopefully it hasn't caused confusion. But at this point, part 4 will be addressing what the early church, the first few hundred years, those who were students of the apostles and those that were students of the apostles, and even their successors all the way up to about 300. So we'll see what they say about this topic, and see. It not only is it important to see, well, what do they think? They're speaking the same language as the not only the writers of the New Testament, but all the people of the period of the New Testament, even those that didn't write. So Jesus. Does that mean Jesus didn't speak Aramaic? We know he did, because they transliterate in Greek characters, some of his Aramaic sayings, even on the cross. When he said, uh, let's see, what did he say? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. That's in Greek characters, but that's Aramaic. But anyway, all that to say that people of the first few hundred years, everybody speaking Greek, even for a few hundred years before Christ came, when Alexander the Great conquered the world around 300 BC. It transitioned to where all those conquered peoples, which is pretty much that whole landmass over there on the other side of the ocean. Again, I live in the United States, so we're talking about the Middle East, modern Middle East, Europe, Italy, North Africa, modern day Turkey. Even off into, areas of, what might be considered Asia, and just that whole landmass over there. Everybody was speaking, Greek by the time Christ arrived. So there was a common language base, for the apostles to be launched and then go and fulfill the prophecies that the nations outside of Israel, the Gentiles, would be brought into the faith, as Paul in many of his letters show the ingrafting of the Gentiles into the vine, who is Christ, as Jesus called himself in John chapter 15. But so these people, the first few hundred years, all the way up to 300s, and things were starting to transition towards the language of the Roman, Empire, which of course was Latin. But when the Romans conquered, before Christ came, I don't know, maybe 50, 100 years before Christ came, when they conquered Greece and, took over this whole region and kind of swallowed it up, and it became a Roman Empire. The Latin language it took a long time, took many centuries before it started becoming the language of the common people, and we have a lot of evidence for that. So anyway, so the language of the people. So these people are speaking that language. So that's one reason when they're reading the scriptures, real close to the fountainhead. Not to mention, still in the 2nd century, having many people that were students of the apostles. The apostle John, according to what we have written testimony, died around 100 A.D. So his students and even the other apostles still lived off into many decades into the period of the 100s, which is the 2nd century. And so names like Ignatius and Polycarp and Clement and Irenaeus, well, Irenaeus being a student of Polycarp, and then people like Clement of Alexandria being students of some of these gentlemen that were, these apostles, these brethren that were disciples or students of the apostles. They're living all the way through the period of the 2nd century, the 100s. And so to not listen to them is irrational. So, I've read so many of their writings, and they have so brought me closer to God. And it's such a ridiculous argument for somebody to immediately jump to something like, well, that doesn't mean they're inspired. It's not an issue of whether they're inspired. It's an issue of like, for instance, if you could go back in a time machine, right? And you could let's say you could spend a couple years being around the apostles, right? And then all of a sudden you're ported back in your time machine to this period of time. And then you're trying to get people to listen to what you've learned. You're pointing things out in the scriptures you never quite got before, you never quite understood, and it's all making sense to you now. And now all of a sudden you're trying to point it out to people, and people are just, all they can say to you is yeah, but you're not inspired. You're not the Bible, and it's such a irrational argument. So anyway, enough of that. We'll have other videos where we'll discuss those sorts of things, but we'll look at them in part 4. We'll look at what the early church said. So that's one reason, as I've just described, why it's good to listen to them. The other reason why it is it if they all start, which if they do, I mean, geographically dispersed through the whole region I talked about, we're hearing them talk about, divorce and remarriage and about these sorts of things, and looking at what they're saying, not only is for the reasons I said, but also points to the types of manuscripts they must have had. So since we've got these different manuscripts in the last 2,000 years, and we've got certain ones that speak a certain way, earlier on, but then they maybe a little bit of difference often in the future, like say Matthew 19:9, for instance. It points to the fact that those other manuscripts, since they're all saying the same thing, must have been the manuscripts that they had. Because when you read their writings, if anyone has, and you really seek to do the will of God, and you are purging yourself from living a life of sin like I used to live, and you're really trying to live righteously and do the will of God and obey Jesus and being sanctified by the Holy Spirit as a result and all those sorts of things, and you're listening to how these guys lived, and they're just amazingly godly disciples of Jesus Christ, living the life and the righteousness just coming off the pages, and you're hearing all this, you can't help but just think these guys are not liars. I mean, they're all saying the same thing. I mean, and so that's the reason why I think part 4 is very important. And then part 5 will be really looking at Matthew 19. We're going to look at it from many different points of view, and I'm going to provide proof. I mean, I'm typically a type person where I say, well, here's evidence, and here's my position, here's what I think. So much proof has been shown to me. I believe it was from God. I mean, that the original writing and rendering of the manuscripts that we got 2 basic variations for Matthew 19:9. One of them reads like Matthew 5:32, and one reads like the modern day Bibles. All of them, including the King James, they all read a quote unquote what is called by theologians and scholars exception clause. Whereas the oldest ones that we have, and admittedly, when you get, I think, let's see, Codex Sinaiticus is believed to be mid to late 4th century, and then maybe you skip a century, maybe you get into 6th century or whatever. But you've got some of these different manuscripts that are pretty old too that read like the exception clause. But then some of the older ones that we have, they read like Matthew 5:32. And so I'm going to show different evidences, that prove, from Matthew 19, the what we have in our manuscripts now, and some of it would be like, well, I'll present some of the way they've translated some of these passages, kind of convolute or put clouds over, so we can't even, like, eclipses our view from really seeing the obviousness of which rendering is the correct one for Matthew 19:9. So I'm going to present lots of evidence, and I'm sure it's going to be pretty compelling to most people that are really seeking the truth to see, yeah, this is proof. It really did read like Matthew 5:32. So come on back for that. So let's get into here what part 3D is going to be about here. And this is just bringing, like I said, Paul's words into a conclusion. We'll pick up where we left off 1 Corinthians 7, which was, we left off at verse 28, just starting to get into verse 29. So we'll pick up from verse 29. We'll finish up the chapter, which is, 40 verses. And in verse 29, Paul reminds us that time is short until Lord Jesus Christ returns, is what he implies. And, it's pointing to what Jesus said, because he's saying the time is short. And then he goes on and really shaking people up, saying, look, if you're married, live as if you're unmarried. Look at these unmarried people. And then he kind of lays it out. He's like, the unmarried, the virgins, the widows, they're so devoted to God, whereas you married people are just devoted on temporal things here in this life. You're not really focused on the eternal things. You're focused on things now and on pleasing your spouse. And I'm urging you, don't do that. And why is that? Because Jesus taught only those who do the will of God are going to enter the kingdom of heaven. So when Christ comes back, this picture of the judgment in Matthew 25:31 to the end of the chapter, which is verse 46, where he separates the sheep from the goats, That's a picture of those that repented and turned from living the way that was displeasing to God, living for themselves, to start living the way that's actually pleasing to God. And so this sort of theme is scattered throughout Paul's writings, and this is what he's saying here. He's like, time is short. So that's what he's talking about. And we'll see, again, Paul points out that virgins, unmarried, and widows tend to focus vertically on God, but the married tend to have an earthly focus, as I said, kind of a horizontal focus only, not as focused, on God. And that's a big temptation when you're married. So that's why he says, live as if you're, as you're unmarried. Of course, many people can distort what Paul says, and we looked at in 2 Peter chapter 3 and previous sections of this series to kind of see how Peter is warning us that many people will take a lot of things that Paul says, which is totally correct, but they'll proof text it, they'll pull it out of context, and they'll completely shipwreck what Paul is saying, and turn it into some sort of heresy or something. So, but verse 35, Paul says he does not want to restrain us, but he wants to direct us to correct devotion to the Lord, and that's why he's saying these things. Verse 36 to 38, if a man feels like we've already looked at from verse 25 to 28, where we were looking at the right understanding of that was an unmarried man engaged to a virgin, and the whole picture of, the admonishment throughout the letter for everyone that's unmarried not to marry. But if you feel like you need to, and he talked about a couple different reasons. One is lack of self-control, and Satan would tempt you. And, he said that in like verse 6, 7, 8, that sort of thing. And the verse 1, it's good for a man not to even touch a woman and all this kind of stuff. So that's why when you get to verse 28 and he says, but if you marry, you have not sinned, right? So here, verse 36 to 38, he's addressing this, and he's kind of bringing it to a conclusion where he's saying, hey, if you're devoted and engaged to a virgin and quote-unquote bound to a virgin, if you feel like you need to marry, go ahead and marry. It's good that you do that, but it's better if you don't. And what he's saying is it's better for eternity because, again, Matthew 19, 11, and 12, Jesus says, 3 types of eunuchs. The eunuch that is the one where a man just makes the decision, you know what, I'm going to devote myself to God. I'm going to focus on God. And it's not just a man, but a woman. That's what evolved over the centuries into, as the church became increasingly Catholic and it became into this idea of a celibate priest or a celibate nun. Or that's what it evolved into, just by a kind of a tradition, and this is the way they did it, or whatever. That's not really how it was in the early church. It was more focused on, here's the teachings, and it's for all Christians. Hey, if you get married, it's good. It's just better if you don't, kind of thing. So, and in verse 39, a wife is bound to her husband until he dies, until he sleeps. Literally, what it says. And of course, that's used Old Testament, New Testament many times to refer to death. And so then the question is this include a remarriage? So that's a big question many times, where people say, okay, well, I've been forgiven because I've been, saved, and all that's in the past, and so now that I'm remarried, well, God hates divorce, and then they point to Malachi, and it's, in kind of a myopic, narrow view sense, without looking the totality of what God is saying about divorce and remarriage. That seems to make a reasonable argument. It's like, okay, I'm married, and so the wife is bound to her husband with that. Well, if you think about it, just consider it's like if a wife is bound to her husband, then she was bound to her first husband until he dies. But if he's still alive, well, then she's still bound to him. So now that she's in this other marriage, and we're going to look a little bit of that as well in Romans 7, 2 and 3, he talks about that. If a woman, gets with another man and marries another man, she's committing adultery. But if he dies, if that first husband dies, she's no longer called an adulteress, right? And so that sheds a little light on this. But this verse here, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39, together with Romans 7, 2 and 3, we'll look at that, kind of paints the picture to answer this question. And I know in my own life, that together with, all of this, just looking at it so much, together with actually in the Old Testament, when I read at the end of the book of Ezra, which is at the same time period as the book of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah, just to give you a real quick, just in case you're not that familiar with the chronologically speaking, the end of the Old Testament, Ezra and Nehemiah, chronologically speaking, are pretty much among the, if not the, books at the end of our, of our Old Testament, of the Protestant Old Testament. And so, Nehemiah, I mean, when they were in, exile in Babylon, God had allowed Judah, or the southern kingdom of Israel, which is Judah and, uh, uh, but anyway, kingdom of Judah, southern kingdom, to go into exile into Babylon. And, Nebuchadnezzar conquered them, and right around 586, the last set of the three groups of exiles, were, sent off to Babylon, and were there. And so from the time of the first set of exiles, as Jeremiah the prophet had prophesied, they would be there for 70 years. And so, Daniel and Ezekiel were some of the prophets that were among them during that period of time, and those books are during that period of time. But, after the 70 years, and they were allowed to go back, and then at that point, the Medes Persian Empire had conquered Babylon. And so now, as, Jerusalem was rebuilt, and then the king, sent, Nehemiah as the governor to help rebuild the wall around Jerusalem, because, it was kind of vulnerable because it didn't have the wall. And so the king, God had moved the heart of the king to send Nehemiah back. So Nehemiah is the governor, and then he sent Ezra as a Levitical priest to reestablish and redevote and lead the people back to the law of Moses. And so it was kind of the teamwork of Ezra and Nehemiah that was getting these people devoted and back on straight with God, which was the next generation of those that were actually sent into exile, and had the anyway in to exile in Babylon. I'll just leave it at that. And so during this period of time, at the end of these books, we see the same account being recorded, and it's the account of Ezra and Nehemiah both coming to Jerusalem to reestablish, rebuilt Jerusalem, and finding that these husbands, like the prophet Malachi was talking about, had divorced their wives, and the wives of their youth, that their Jewish wives, and remarried foreign, Gentile, pagan worshiping wives, and they had had children with them. And so, as we see at the end of that story, both of those books record this. It's a really tragic story, that the admonishment for repentance, the works of repentance that they had to do to get back right with God, was to, kind of like this, does this include remarriage, kind of thing. They were disobeying the law. For them to repent, they had to, quote unquote, divorce their wives, and send them outside of the city gates with these children. It was a tragic story, but they, for them to get back right with the law, and when I saw that, and I saw the big picture of everything with Christ and New Covenant and His teachings and everything, I saw, wow, that's analogous to what's going on today with this whole divorce and remarriage problem, because I'm seeing what Jesus is preaching, what the apostles are preaching about divorce and remarriage. And so here I am in a remarriage. I've got someone that's been married a couple of times, and I mean, I'd never been married before, but I'm living in adultery. I'm living with this man's wife. Verse 39, a wife is bound to her husband until he dies, as long as he lives. And so she's still married to this first husband, just like everybody on the planet. And that's the big question where people will ask sometimes, and there's really nothing in the scriptures to support this, but they'll speculate and go, well, that only applies when you're a Christian. And it's like, well, where's that in the scriptures? Because I don't see that at all. That's just something that's totally speculative. It's wishful thinking. It's people trying to escape, what the Bible teaches about divorce and remarriage being adultery. And so anyway, let's move on. Okay, before we move on, let's look at something here in verse 28. Before we move on to verse 29, let's look at something here I just want to point out. Starting with the NASB, yet such will have trouble in this life, and I'm trying to spare you. But for those who, NIV, but for those who marry will face troubles in this life, I want to spare you this. ESV, yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, I want to spare you this. King James is much closer to what the Greek actually says. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh. Though nevertheless, those such, referring to those people, kind of third person plural type thing, they kind of idea. Such as those shall have trouble in the flesh, but I want to spare you this. It's kind of really what the Greek says. So anyway, what I wanted to point out was, again, let me remind us, verse 25 is setting the tone, the context of what we're about to, the following verses, that we're talking about virgins, right? People that are not married, virgins. And then it goes on from there, and as we looked, these four here all translate gune as wife and aner as husband. But the word actually means, the two words mean man and woman. There is no word in New Testament Greek, Koine Greek, for husband and wife. It's not used in the New Testament. Does it exist? Quite possibly. I'm not aware of one. I haven't seen one yet, even in the Greek Old Testament. So, but could be, but doesn't really matter. The point is, it's not in the New Testament. The words that are used there are gune for woman, aner for man. You look at the study, you study the context, you look at the context, and you make the decision. It's a discretionary thing. This is talking about husband, this is wife. This is what they've done here. So these four here, the Authorized King James, the ESV, the Good News Translation, and the NASB, and they've translated these words as if somebody that is married, with verse 27, especially right here, are you bound to a wife, do not seek to be released. So this would be the word that's actually used, luo, it's actually used in the Gospels when Jesus speaks about what is translated as divorce. Now I contend that apoluo, it doesn't have a connotation to it of any legalities at all, per se. But, could they have maybe been using it that way, and that's really rightful that they translate as divorce? I haven't seen that yet. I'm not convinced of that yet myself. I think they're kind of making a stretch to pull it over and do our word, translate it into our word, into this culture, which when somebody says divorce, they're not just thinking about somebody packing their bags, hey, you got to leave. They're actually saying, we got to go to court and get some paperwork done, whatever. And apoluo, in the four different passages that we've looked at in part 1, part 2, that Jesus uses them, which is Matthew 5, 31, 32. Verse 31, pointing back to the law of Moses. Of course, the law of Moses refers to it because he says a certificate of apoluo. So the certificate combined with it, the context of those combined words would say, hey, let's talk about a divorce, right? But anyway, then verse 32, it's just apoluo, right? And then going on from there, Matthew 19 and Mark 10 and Luke 16, verse 18. Is that really should it be translated as divorce, or should it just be talking about, putting them outside the house and they got to go live somewhere else? I'm not sure. I tend to think that it's not necessarily, because it doesn't talk about a certificate of apoluo. The only place it talks about that is in Matthew 5:31, which is a pointer. It's like I could be pointing my fingers. We're pointing back to Deuteronomy chapter 24. That's what it's pointing at. And it's saying, because you have heard it of old. Jesus did that throughout the whole Sermon on the Mount, point by point by point, whether he's talking about taking oaths, or he's talking about marriage, or he's talking about loving your enemies, whatever. You have heard it of old. And he'd refer and he'd start quoting the law of Moses from Deuteronomy, right? And then he'd say, but I say to you, right? So anyway, in this case, let's look at what we got going on here. So this is the word that could be translated as divorce. Do you seek to, but it doesn't have to, because it's used, tons of times in New Testament. It has nothing to do with marriage. It just has to do with loosening a tie, Like I said, Jesus sent the apostle he's leading up to Passover. He sends him to go get the donkey so he could ride into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, what we call Palm Sunday. It's when he unties the rope off the post, it's luo, it's that verb. So, and there's other similar sort of things that have nothing to do with marriage that used throughout the New Testament type idea. So if this was to rightly be translated gune as wife, then rightfully you could say, hey, this is divorce. If, that's a big if, capital letters. But are you bound to a woman, as in the case of like some sort of betrothal if they're Jews, or what we would call in our modern day some sort of engagement or something? That's what I contend that they're talking about here. So let's take a look in context of what he's saying right here, see if that sheds any light, just logically speaking. Are you released from a woman? Do not seek a woman. Do not seek a wife. Do not seek a woman. Right? It's good for a man to remain as he is. Right? So it's good to remain as he is, if what this is conveying, translated as it is, including the King James, because I use the word put away, then it's suggesting that they're married, and that, you know, are you released from a wife? Are you divorced from a wife? Do not seek a wife. If it really means that, this is again the kind of language that is if. It's a question. If. But if you marry, you have not sinned. So if it's true that this really is, husband and wife, that's the way it should be translated, and we're talking about divorce and we're talking about remarriage. If that's true, then looking at verse 26, that it's good for a man to remain as he is, and down here, yet such shall have trouble in this life, I want to spare you this. If he's already married, he's not going to encourage him to stay as he is. Because down here he's encouraging you, look, I'm encouraging you not to, to avoid that, because you're going to have troubles in marriage, basically is what he's saying, right? So it would make sense that if this is an engagement or a betrothal type idea, that this would say, hey, it's good for a man to remain as he is, which means single. Are you bound to a woman? Are you bound to a woman? Gune means woman. Do not seek to be released from that obligation, in other words, is the implication. Are you released from a woman? Do not seek a woman. Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you have not sinned. And again, keep it in context of, verse 1, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Verse 8, for the unmarried and the virgins, it's good for them not to be married. But if they can't exercise self-control, it's good for them to get married, right? And just leading all the way up to this point, all this kind of stuff for everybody to stay as they are, for him to remain single, and especially since verse 25, like we see right here, they say it's unmarried, but verse 25, Parthenos, now concerning virgins, that's what this is about. It's good for a man to remain as a virgin, to remain as he is. Are you bound to some sort of obligation to a woman to marry? That is the implication, I believe. Do not seek to be released, but are you released from that woman? Do not seek a wife. Do not seek a woman. But if you marry, you have not sinned. So again, everything we've looked at in the past, somebody could mistake that from those things that we've gone over and over and over. A man not to touch a woman. Somebody could mistake that and say, I think Paul's saying that we shouldn't marry. We can't marry. And he's saying, I'm not saying you can't marry. It's not a sin to marry, and that would just make total sense. And if the virgin marries, she has not sinned, right? Yet such will have trouble in this life. I want to spare you this. So if he's trying to spare you this of actually getting married, it would make no sense to translate this as if they're already married, because he's not going to encourage them to stay married as he is here. Hey, it's good for a man to remain married, right? I mean, that's if that's what it means. If it's good for a husband to remain as he is, are you bound to a wife? If that's really what we're saying, then for him to all of a sudden lead that into a point of saying, hey, I'm encouraging you to stay single, because if you get married, you're going to have problems, then this would make no sense in that context. But if it is, as the NIV has translated, about a betrothal, about some sort of engagement, then it would make total sense. This would make sense. Everything we've read up to this point about remaining single, and that he finally says, hey, it's not a sin to marry, it just all comes together and makes sense. That it is good for a man to remain as he is, to remain single. Do you have an obligation to get married? If you do, then don't get out of it, because like Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Everything else comes from evil. And as James, in the book of James, the epistle of James, echoes the words of the Lord, he says, or else be condemned. So if you don't do what you say you're going to do, it's going to lead to condemnation and judgment. So he's saying, hey, if you're obligated, don't seek to get out of it. But if you're released, then it's good not to marry. And he says here, I'm trying to spare you from this sort of thing. But if you do marry, you haven't sinned. So anyway, I think I've made that pretty clear there. Let's move on. Verse 29. But this I say, brethren, the time has been shortened, so that from now on, those who have wives, or those who have women, those who have wives, should be as though they had none, and those who weep as though they did not weep. Right? Now here's another sort of thing in Paul's letters, like Peter says. Go back to Peter, 2 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 15 to 17. Paul writes the same way in all his letters, and many people distort what he says to their own destruction. And he goes on in the verse 18, but you've been warned, right? And so people can really play games with Paul's letters. And that's why the Gnostics loved Paul's letters and they would just play games. Because here, somebody could take this out of context, and that's the only way you can play games with Paul's letters. If you start forgetting that there's chapters and verses and read it like one contiguous epistle, where it's all, the context is the whole letter, especially the book of Romans, because that is the most abused book. But anyway, just the whole letter, right? If you don't get, just surgically cut out some piece and do some sort of proof texting and cut out the context of what he's saying, then you can't do that, because Paul is writing, godly stuff from the Lord. But if you play that surgical game in proof text, you can have a heyday. And they could do that with this. He's saying, hey, let's read it again. Somebody could really distort some wacky craziness with this. Verse 29, but this I say, brethren, the time has been shortened, so that from now on those who have wives should live as if they have none, should be as if they have none, right? Now, could somebody not play games with that? Yes, they could. And similarly, when, all this other stuff that Paul was saying up here, Paul finally has to slam on the brakes and say, look, it's not a sin if you get married. In verse 28, he says that, right? And just like I said in Romans 6, verse 1, he's saying, he's been talking about grace. And in chapter 3, he says, some people are saying because we're showing that those that have sinned more need more grace, and that eventually is going to lead to the glory of God. The person said, well, if my sinning brings glory to God and good comes out of it, why am I condemned? And he says their condemnation is deserved because they're not even trying to understand. They're trying to escape responsibility for their sins and trying to play games. So anyway, moving on, verse 30. And those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as if they did not rejoice, and those who buy as if they do not possess. Because again, Jesus says, do not store up treasures on earth. And New Testament teaches about using, our extra to bless Jesus. Jesus said, when you give to those, least of my brethren, you're given to me. And Matthew 25:31-46 is a really scary picture of that at the judgment of, those that ignore Jesus' teachings on storing up treasures on earth. And those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it for the form of this world. In other words, the whole, what we're seeing of this world. I'm trying to think of a synonym for that word. I know it's something to do with morph in the Greek. I forget exactly how to pronounce that word, but it's where we get in English our word about morphine, where we're kind of molding and shaping some form of something. But that's what we're talking about. The form of this world is passing away. In 2 Peter chapter 3, in that passage it talks about when Christ comes back, the whole earth is going to be flooded with fire, and the earth is going to be sanctified with fire. Just like the first time in the flood, the great flood, the deluge, that Noah's flood, that it was done by water. The second time it's going to be with fire. And so that's what he's talking about there. Okay, verse 32. So we'll start off here, King James. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. There's a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Right? So, that was, I read all the way from verse 32. So let's look at the ESV. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord, and the married man is anxious about the worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided, and the unmarried or the betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about the worldly things, how to please her husband, right? And so what we're reading here has everything to do with what I was pointing out in verse 30, how people could play games with this. But it brings clarity to what Paul was talking about in verse 30. Starting right, maybe it was verse 29, yeah. But I say, brethren, the time is shortened, and so from now on those who have wives should live, or should be as if though they have none, right? That was verse 29. Let's see how the King James reads. But this I say, brethren, the time is shortened, it remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none. Or verse 29 ESV, this is what I mean, brothers, appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none. Right? So this whole idea of live as though you had no wife is exactly what he's talking about here from 32 to 34. Basically where he's saying all the unmarried people are focused vertically on God, and the married people have a tendency to be focused on horizontally on just the things on ground level. Because, right, what is it we're to pray? Jesus commands us to pray the Lord's Prayer. And I know Protestants, Catholics, people aren't doing this. Catholics, some people that are Catholic pray it, but typically they just recite it. And it's really sad that it's turned into that. All they do is recite it. It's part of the rosary, it's part of, and they just recite it. They're not really praying it, right? But Jesus commands us to pray this. And when I started studying the early Christians and see that they actually prayed this 3 times a day, I mean, this actually writes the desires of God on our hearts. That's the whole point of praying the prayer. Not getting to where you just recite it mind-numbingly, because if you're doing that, I mean, it's an insult to God. Let it come from your heart. Write it on your heart. Just like maybe you got the same song that you're singing to God all the time. I hope it's coming from your heart and it's not just, rote memory or something. You're just reciting things. I hope it's from your heart. And so if we're praying what God tells us to pray in the Lord's Prayer, we're going to see, where we're asking for Him to help us, to just as things are in heaven, and the devotion and the undivided, obedience and submission to God and the purity and all this kind of stuff, for it to be like that on earth as it is in heaven, for it to be the same, right? And that's what he's saying. The people that are married have a tendency to not be focused on heaven, so they can imitate the things of how they are in heaven, so they can start, duplicating those things on earth, so the Lord will be pleased. They're focused solely on the earth. They only look horizontally, things of this world, pleasing their wife, pleasing their husband, all those things. Whereas the people that are unmarried have a tendency to be devoted to God, right? Not necessarily, but we're talking about real Christians here, so that's what Paul's talking about. But that's what he's saying. That's what he's saying. Moving on to verse 35. Let's start with the NASB here. This I say for you. And he's saying, I'm saying this for your own good. This I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you. So I'm not trying to put some sort of heavy yoke upon you. I'm just trying to point you to the things that are going to echo into eternity. It's going to help you to get close to God, to be like God, So anyways, I'm not trying to put a restraint on you, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. So that was NASB. Let's see what the ESV says. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order, to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. So he's saying, imitate how these godly single people are focused vertically. You married people, take note and imitate that. That's what he's saying. And this also sheds light, too, as we're finally getting to this point, to now think back to why Paul's saying it's good to not be married. It's good to not be married because it's easier for you to train yourself to where you're just vertically focused on God. So that's another reason. We'll see what the NIV says. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. So that's good. They did a good job there. Verse 35 down here, good news. I am saying this because I want to help you. I am not trying to put restrictions on you. Instead, I want you to do what is right and proper and to give yourself completely to the Lord's service without any reservation. So all these are good. Verse 35, they're all good. I mean, is it word for word? I mean, some Bibles, that's not their style. Their style is to what is this saying in Greek? And when you try to do a word for word, you lose a lot when you bring it into English, because English doesn't have the power that the Greek language has, the Koine Greek language has. It's a very stripped down language. It doesn't have much for the extra information that's embedded in every word in Greek, just the way the Greek language is and stuff. So that's why they kind of round it out to kind of take, well, here's the other things that the Greek language is saying, And sometimes they mix in their opinions together with stuff that's really objectively in there. It's just hard to see it word for word if you kind of do that type thing. So anyway, that's up to verse 35. Let's go on to verse 36. In the case of an engaged couple who have married, so we're starting with the Good News Translation. In the case of an engaged couple who have decided not to marry, if the man feels that he is acting properly toward the young woman, and if his passions are too strong, and he feels that he ought to marry, then they should get married, as he wants to. There's sin in this, right? So that's verse 36. Let's look at some of the other translations. But we already recognized up here where he says in verse 28, he's like, you're not sinning if you get married. So he's already mentioned that in case this whole letter, as we've been looking, hopping across like a frog on the lily pads at these different points throughout the letter, that could lead somebody to think, whoa, it's a sin to marry. And of course over in Colossians, he mentions there that people, heretics will actually say it's a sin to marry. And it's not a sin to marry. It's just a really wise idea is what Paul preaches, right? So, and then he unfolds in this letter a couple different reasons why that is. So anyway, so we read verse 36. Let's go over to King James on verse 36. But if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him do what he will, or what he desires. He sinneth not. Let them marry. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, have no necessity, but hath power over his own will. And he's kind of talking about self-control there. And hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, doeth well also. So then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her that is not in marriage doeth better. Alright, so that's this sort of idea here. Now, we're going to look at some of these other translations. Some of these translations have added their opinions into this, which is not in the Greek. But they're thinking, well, we're trying to make sense out of how it's talking about, the virgin and everything. And they actually throw in the idea, some of these translations, that it's a father giving his virgin daughter in marriage. But the Greek doesn't actually say that. But that's their opinion. And this could be understood that way, but it's not very clear. Let's look at the ESV. Verse 37, but whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, because again, we've been talking about self-control in this letter, going all the way back to the first 10 verses, 9 verses, and having his desire under control, and is determined in his own heart, to keep her as his betrothed, or his virgin, he will do well. So then, he who marries is his betrothed, or the virgin, does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do better, because that's what he's been saying. That's exactly what Jesus preached in Matthew 19. Anyone that can accept this voluntary eunuch proposition that I'm putting forth should accept it, right? And that's kind of what Paul's been saying throughout this letter. It's better to not be married. So he's saying if somebody, keeps the virgin, and she's getting beyond the flower of her age or whatever, and he feels like, hey, he needs to marry, maybe the passion's getting coming upon him. And of course we read in verse 8, some of those in the early on in this letter, it says it's better to marry than to burn, and so it's kind of telegraphing that idea here as well. But if he chooses not to marry, he does even better, right? And he goes on from there. He says a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, but only in the Lord. And so let's go over here. So good news. We'll start verse 37. But if a man, without being forced to do so, has firmly made up his mind not to marry, and if he has his own will under complete control and has already decided in his own mind what to do, then he does well not to marry the young woman. So the man who marries does well, and the one who doesn't marry does even better. Because that's what he's been saying all along. He's been saying, hey, it's good not to marry. Verse 36. But if any man think that he acts unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, let's see, let me check good news on verse 36 as well. In the case of an engaged couple, if they decide not to marry, if the man feels that he is not acting properly toward the young woman, has passion are too strong, he feels that he ought to marry, then he should get married, as he wants to. There is no sin in this. Okay. So I guess it's just the NASB. They throw that in. Now you can see that word daughter is in italics because that's opinion. That's what the translators are saying. Hey, we think this is talking about a father towards his daughter, and I couldn't disagree more. But anyway, verse 36. But if any man think that he is acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, if she is past her youth, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let her marry. But he who stands firm in his heart, being under no constraint, but has authority over his own desires, his own will, and has decided this in his own heart, to keep his own virgin, again, italics, they put the word daughter, to keep his own virgin, daughter, he will do well. He will do better, right? He will do well. So yeah, that's how they're seeing this. But as you can see, as we've been unfolding throughout this letter, a lot of the same tenets of somebody exercising self-control. The other one is that it's better not to marry, but it's not a sin to marry. And if you can't control yourself, it's better to go ahead and get married. But you do even better if you don't get married, right? And so yeah, this adding this daughter sort of idea is totally adding to Scripture, but that's the way they saw it. And sometimes with translating it, you can either be really awkwardly worded the way the King James does it, and they do a pretty good word for word, or you could try and smooth it out, but you end up tending sometimes to kind of throw some of your theological opinions into it, and then you end up with this kind of idea, what the NASB has done in verse 37 and 38, or 36, 37, 38. Let's see what the NIV says. Starting in verse 36. If anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, which is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then, he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. They did a really good job there. The NIV did a good job in those passages. And again, verse 39, we've been talking about this. They all pretty much say the same thing. That a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if he dies or if he sleeps, she's free to marry another Christian. But, another man, but only in the Lord. In verse 40, but in my opinion, she is more blessed or happier if she remains as she is. And that's the idea of what we've been saying. I mean, in the early church, first couple of centuries, the ministry that virgins had as intercessory prayer warriors on behalf of the church, because, the heart of God is so much more inclined to those people that don't have the physical advantages, whether it's they're poor or they're orphans or they've been abused, and especially if they're being abused and they're actually being humble. Because a lot of those examples you'd see in the Old Testament, people like Daniel and Joseph, just men that were really being unjustly treated, because they're foreshadowings of Christ, because this all points to Christ. That's the Christ life, right? The people that are just blameless, but they're abused and they're kicked around, and this is the way Jesus preaches. His whole preaching in Luke 6 and the Sermon on the Mount and stuff is, blessed are those who live this way. Because in the end, if you read Luke 16, where you talk a picture of Lazarus, the poor man, Lazarus, and it was abused, versus the rich man that lived it up or whatever, that's an application of a picture of exactly what the message that the Bible's conveying. That so many people just ignore and miss, because they so want to make it just this easy believism, this, hey, I got saved and now I'm just waiting on Jesus' bus stop, waiting him to come pick me up and I go to heaven. And they're ignoring all of his preaching. They're ignoring the scattered messages throughout the Old Testament, and so much of this stuff that God's heart is to those that are suffering. And so that's why the New Testament talks so much about the role of suffering for Christians and stuff, and we really have to embrace it, because we're imitating Christ, and it's part of what sanctifies us and transforms us into humble, godly, virtuous people that resemble God when we're submitting ourselves to this injustice and stuff. So, and when we get that on straight, the whole idea of divorce and remarriage and some of the suffering and that goes with it and stuff is just a slam dunk. It's really easy to accept and stuff. But when we're still trying to accept that no, Jesus did it all and we don't have to do anything and Jesus died so we can all have a great life now instead of in the afterlife after the resurrection, then it's really difficult to accept the difficulties that God lays upon those on the humble. I mean, that's the grace, the true grace of God is the difficult life as a Christian. So anyway, that's 1 Corinthians 7. I hope this helps you. God bless you. Okay, so we said we would talk about, finish up Paul's comments on this topic on a divorce and remarriage. And of course, in Romans 7, 2 and 3, he talks about it. He's using it as he often does in many of his writings, uses different situations as an analogy to make a point. In fact, he does that later on in this chapter where he's actually using first person singular as if it's him that is walking in the flesh, and he makes a point in chapter 8 that somebody that lives that way, is separated from God and puts enmity between themselves and God, and they cannot please God if they're walking in the flesh. But at the end of this chapter, he's kind of doing that. Many people, they just take it out of context and what he's saying there. But anyway, he does that quite often where he'll make a point about something, use something in real life, whether he's talking about, like for instance, he'll talk about oxen and how God in the law established the yoke and the sort of thing where when the oxen are treading out the grain, they're to be allowed, they're commanded by God to be allowed to eat. And he makes the point, he's like, does God care about oxen? Or is he not saying this so that we can, the implication being so we can use it as an analogy to understand God's will with regard to those that are actually working for the Lord, and that they should be allowed to, live off the gospel and stuff. So anyway, point being is he uses all these different types of analogies and literary devices or whatever to kind of bounce off of and make points and kind of comparative sort of thing so that people can see from real life and understand what he's saying. In fact, it's a little bit similar to what Jesus did with parables, so very similar sort of thing. But anyway, so we're going to look at here Romans 7, 2 and 3, and we're not going to focus at the analogy that God is using. We're just going to focus at the truth in the analogy itself about divorce and remarriage, not why he's saying it and how it compares to chapter 6, too much about what he was talking about there, about us dying with Christ in baptism, and that's the illustration he's using right here. But we'll just get into the whole truth of the statement itself in verse 2 and 3, and then we'll look at Hebrews chapter 13 and the statement that is made here. Now, according to the ancient church writings that we use to understand many things, like for instance, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they don't say, hey, this is the Gospel of Matthew, this is the Gospel of Mark, Luke, John. The reason why we know that is because of Eusebius' church history and him saying the things that he said. So similarly, some of these things, according to people like Eusebius and even people before him, saying that they believe that the book of Hebrews was written by Paul. Be that as it may, whether that's true or false or whatever, we're going to look at it anyway because it is a statement. It's kind of we're not going to get into hey, was it really Paul wrote that, because it's kind of not really our point. But we'll just toss it in here to finish up this section on part 3, which is looking at what Paul taught on divorce and remarriage. So let's pick it up here. So Romans chapter 7, verse 2. We'll start off with the Authorized King James over here to the right. For the woman which hath a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he liveth. But if the husband is dead, be dead. Right? In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 39, it actually uses the word sleep. But many places in the New Testament we can see clearly that when it's talking sleep, it's talking kind of a spiritual sense, and we're talking about actually, physical death. Like when Jesus talked about Lazarus, that he was going to raise from the dead, was sleeping, and then his disciples weren't catching on, so he had to say Lazarus is dead. He had to just come out and tell them because they weren't following and stuff. So anyway, 1 Corinthians 7 verse 39 uses sleep, but here, same idea, but it's actually saying dead. So, but if the husband is dead, she is loosed from the law, the obligation to the law, from the law of her husband. So then, in other words, therefore, while her husband liveth, she she be married to another man, she be called an adulteress. She shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. I'll just tell you in the Greek, heteros, that it's being used here, it's not using like in English, it's translated a lot of times as other or another, allos. It's not using that word because that's just, if you're talking, if I had a bunch of different things of the same type, let's say, I have a bunch of dogs, and let's say I'm actually referring to this other dog over here, that would be the sense of that, right? That's not what this word is. This word is actually where I would actually have, maybe 4 poodles, and then I have a cocker spaniel, and then when I refer to this other different dog, that's the word that this is. Just so you know, there's a little bit of a distinction there. We're actually talking a different man, another man, a completely different man, not just type thing. Well, I hope that was a good analogy, but we're still talking about human beings, so maybe that wasn't a good analogy. But anyway, the idea is we're actually talking about somebody different, so it's making that word, and it's quite possible if I think through it. Well, if they use allos instead of heteros, in this, I guess it could work too. But point being is we're talking about somebody different, and so let's move on. ESV, how does it read? For if a married woman is bound by law, for a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives, but if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress. But if she lives with another man while her husband is alive, so that's a little bit different language than here. If she lived with another man while her husband is alive, but if her husband dies, she is free from the law and she is free from that law. And if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. Right? And so over here, this is the good news. And a married woman, for example, is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if he dies, then she is free from the law that bound her to him. So then, therefore, if she lives with another man while her husband is alive, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is legally free woman and does not commit adultery if she marries another man. I don't really have a problem with any of these so far. For the married woman is bound by the law to her husband while he is living. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law concerning the husband. So then, if while her husband is living she is joined to another man, she be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress, though she is joined to another man. Right? For example, by law, this is the NIV. For example, by law, the married woman is bound to her husband as long as he is alive. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law that binds her to him. So then, if she has sexual relations, now the Greek doesn't really say that. That's kind of a little bit of their opinion they're tossing that in. It doesn't use words that refer to that. It's actually just of her being with somebody else, you know. So it's it's using genomai as the verb it's using, which just has to like in third person singular. That's used many times in past tense. We translate it as "and it came to pass," and then something happened. So it's sort of like basically that, like something happening or whatever. In this case, it's somebody actually being, because it's not the to be verb per se. Like in our there's a close relationship between anai and let's see, what is the genestheni, would be one version of the infinitive. But anyway, to be versus to become, or something to come to pass or happen, would be kind of what that verb is, versus to be as anai. Both of them are kind of predicate nominative sort of sentences, if that means anything to you, if you remember your English grammar. But anyway, it's somebody being with somebody else, or being, I guess you could say joined. It's not really the word for joined, but it's like somebody going and being with somebody else. So I guess that's why they kind of threw in there, hey, that's talking about sexual relations. So then, if she has sexual relations with another man while her husband is still alive, she is called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law that is and is not an adulteress if she marries another man. If he dies, then she's not an adulteress. They're pretty much all saying that. I mean, you could get into nitpicking about some of the words not being exactly word for word or something like that, but they're all pretty much saying the same thing. And it's the idea that, you're bound to your husband as long as you die, or as long as he lives, until he dies. Then you could remarry. And that's what 1 Corinthians 7 verse 39 said. If he sleeps, if he dies, then she's free to remarry, but only someone in the Lord, only another Christian, right? And so this is the law of Christ. This is the teaching that Jesus says. You've heard it of old. Kind of Deuteronomy sort of thing, chapter 22, 24 there, whatever. We didn't really go into that, but that's where Moses kind of talked about some things about in the Mosaic law about the teaching, and it made allowance for divorce and remarriage. Um, it says if a husband finds some uncleanness in her, that he could put a certificate of divorce in her hand and send her out of his house, and then she could go be another man's wife. So we don't see nothing like that in the teaching of Jesus or the apostles. See, what we hear in Jesus' teaching quite often is referring to the law of Moses, like in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, it says this a lot. You've heard it of old, and he'll refer to Deuteronomy. In fact, every time he says that, it's actually in Deuteronomy. It's not in the other four books of the Torah, or the other four books of the law, or the Pentateuch, if you want to call it that. It's Deuteronomy. And so you've heard it of old, but I say to you, right? See, Jesus says, but I say to you, and then he gives this is the law of Christ. This is the new law, the perfect law that brings freedom, as James called it. The teachings of Jesus is the perfect law. There was a temporary law that definitely brought righteousness and some things or whatever with God's people, but it can't bring them to perfection. And that's what Paul's letters go into this a lot, and he's not the only one, but he does a really good job of showing that. Many people misunderstand that, and it might be partly because of some of the English translations kind of fall short, but to come to maturity, perfection, completeness, one word of that, and I'll just use the adjective form of that, teleos. I talk about this a lot with a lot of friends of mine, is that's all over the New Testament, because it's the idea that we see in Jesus' parables, where it describes when you plant a seed, which is analogous in the Christian life as the Spirit of Christ. Romans chapter 8, whoever doesn't have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. So the Holy Spirit, through Christ, from the Father, is planted in human beings' souls that have been washed, cleansed, purified by the blood of Christ, which happens at baptism. That's another video. We can get into that sometime. But anyway, point being is, when the person becomes and they belong to Christ, they've been set free from the kingdom of darkness. They've been set free. They've been quote-unquote saved. They've been rescued. Sodzday would be third person singular. They've been saved. They've been rescued. They've been brought out of, coming out of Egypt, out of slavery in the kingdom of darkness. They've been saved. And so now they belong to Christ. And that's what he's talking about here. He's using this analogy to say they die. And that's what we saw in Romans chapter 6. They die. And by dying, they're then able to marry Christ and be Christ. And then, of course, the Holy Spirit comes upon them and unites their soul and his spirit together. And they're united to Christ and become a temple of the Holy Spirit. And so that's what we're talking about. Now, if they go back, by doing some of these things that are warned throughout the New Testament that Paul calls, greed, living that covetous sort of life or whatever is idolatry. He calls any kind of sexual immorality, any kind of porneia, he calls it idolatry. Yes, that includes mokeo, that includes, adulteress. I mean, all unlawful sexual activity is uniting yourself with demons, which is idolatry. But it's also spiritual adultery, right? And so that's kind of a little bit of what this is pointing to. So set free from that. And so the literal meaning is what we're talking about with human man and wife, and this is the law of Christ and stuff. So let's move on. So we'll finish up here with Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. We'll start with Authorized King James. Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. But the whoremongers, because this is using the word porneia, the fornicators or sexually immoral, and the adulterers God will judge. ESV, let the marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. Undefiled. We were just looking at how defilement can happen by being with another man. A woman being, a wife being with another man. For God will judge the sexually immoral, porneia, and adulteress. Let's get back on track here. So, anyway, so anyone that's unlawfully sexual, I mean, it's idolatry. Paul calls it in some of his letters. Um, but God will judge them. They've united themselves. They're committing spiritual adultery. They will, with demons, basically idolatry, and the marriage bed must be kept pure, undefiled. They must be united by the law of Christ to their spouse who they're married to. That's like Paul says, as we've looked at in 1 Corinthians 7. He's like, it's better if you don't marry, but if you do, it's not a sin, number one. And in another passage further down near the bottom of the chapter, he said, it's good if the man is devoted to the virgin and he feels like he needs to marry, it's good. But if he doesn't marry, it's even better, right? So, but if we do marry, we are bound by law until death. So marriage, let's see, NASB, marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. The fornicators and adulterers God will judge. And the NIV says marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all sexually immoral. So I know when I saw this, for me, I guess it was 5 or 6 years ago, with all the studying I'd been doing, looking through Jesus, I was seeing just how, I'd learned from a book I'd read called The King That Turned the World Upside Down by David Berceau. It really opened my eyes to a lot, and I started really reading the Gospels a lot, and I was noticing how the church I was a part of, we were, as we understood Paul's letters, we were kind of more focused on the apostles and the epistles, and just treating the Bible as a whole, not really focusing on the teachings of Jesus as being the pinnacle and the critical piece, that everything else should be read through the lens of Jesus' words. And I was seeing that, and I started really going through his words and studying the Gospels a lot. And I don't know, when I read this one time, I guess it was back in 2012, it all of a sudden my eyes were opened, and I just jumped up out of the bed and started grabbing all kind of resources and just started really studying some things out, and that's just started a different chapter of my life, I guess. I started just noticing things, and it was this passage right here that really triggered it, and I started researching, and of course eventually I started noticing things like this, and started going through 1 Corinthians 7, and just over and over and over and over again, the 4 passages from Jesus in the Gospels: Matthew 5:31-32, Matthew 19, 1-12, Mark 10, 1-11, and Luke 16, verse 18, and just went over and over and over, using audio versions of the Bible, listened to them over and over and over, these passages, until they just started all coming together. It just started making sense. I was never taught that the issue was of adultery was remarriage. I was never taught that in my church. I was always kind of just left kind of trying to figure it out for myself, and I couldn't quite figure out, why is divorce adultery? I don't see the connection. And once I saw that it was, it's the one flesh bond, that when God joins, let no man separate, that bond that men cannot separate, their laws don't separate it, and that's why it's adultery. And so once that clicked, that it was the one flesh covenant, that doing this sort of stuff here makes an adultery, makes for an adulteress, or makes for an adulterer type thing, that that's when it clicked. So